Good morning and welcome, and thank you, Fiona, for the introduction. This is a short webinar on third-party risk management, but with a focus on the risk assessment and how to do risk assessment. This is a topic that has become increasingly more important. Those of you who are regulated will have seen guidelines from the European Banking Authority, the Financial Stability Board in the UK, and the Central Bank of Ireland, all wanting to see you better manage your outsourced service providers. Now, we call it third party because we want to include more than just the outsourced service providers, as you shall see. Okay. Briefly, I'm going to give you a brief introduction into who we are. I know a lot of you are regulars at our webinars, but we have a lot of new attendees today as well. I'm going to speak briefly about the difference between risk assessment and due diligence, and there is a bit of overlap, but we're going to focus on the risk assessment. What is a risk-based approach? And it's, again, one slide briefly to describe that. Then we'll get into the meat of it. You know, when do you do a risk assessment, and who do you assess? Who are your third parties, and what are the risks, and how do you analyze that? How do you assess them? There's going to be the nub of what we're talking about today. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about evidence and reporting of that. So, first of all, us. We see ourselves as risk and compliance professionals ourselves, like many of you today. And we maintain our skills through our daily work, but also being members of organizations like the Institute of Risk Management, Institute of Bankers, the Compliance Institute, formerly known as the Association of Compliance Officers. That's a large group. Fiona is a member of that and recently has graduated with distinction in data protection. Institute of Directors, Chartered Accountants, Information Security. So you can see we try to maintain our own skills because we get challenged by our customers. We make a software, cloud hosted, can be in-house as well, for governance, risk and compliance solutions. It's used by, well over 2,000, because a lot of our customers have their customers logging in, but you can see across many sectors, and we're fairly represented by you today. All of these sectors, I would say, are represented in this webinar today. So I've tried in the webinar to address all of you, because you will have different needs depending on whether you're a housing association or whether you're a fund administrator. But I'll try and make it relevant to all of you. I like to include a quote in all of my presentations, and I like Warren Buffett's quotes a lot. He says, "Know what you're getting into before you get into it." Now, for a lot of us, you're in the relationship already, so I would add, and if you're in it already, then know what you've got yourself into. It's never too late to do that risk assessment. Certainly, you need to, and you shouldn't ignore it. So risk assessment and due diligence. I will start with due diligence because I think in the sequence of things, that's where you would start. It's mostly, not 100%, but mostly before you enter an arrangement, that is, enter an agreement to work with a third party. You would do your homework, if you wish, your due diligence. If that third party has to be authorized to carry out the work you're going to give it, then you need to check that their credentials, basically, the authorization credentials, check their capacity to do the work, their ability to do the work for you. And this is kind of fundamental before you get into any agreement with them. I would also suggest you need to check for an alignment with your risk appetite. If you're an organization that takes very little risk and you're going to team up with an organization that is gung-ho on things, I would say there's a misalignment on your risk appetite, and it may not be a good marriage. I would check for alignment on culture and ethical values and behavior. These are kind of things that will tell you whether this marriage is going to last. And, you know, some of our relationships with third parties are long-term and can be as stressful as a marriage, I guess. IT security. This might be phase 2 of due diligence. Because certainly if you're outsourcing your IT to a third party, you're going to That would be the first bit of due diligence you will do. But let's say you're outsourcing a particular function, then you certainly want to know that the third party's IT, which is now housing your information, is secure. So you will have, and in my experience, this is where most of the due diligence seems to happen. And a lot of the non-IT stuff is forgotten or takes second place. So I don't need to tell you to do IT security. I see a lot of people do that already. I would be encouraging you to do more than just IT security. So assuming that there is a match and you're going to get into something with this third party, you now need to probably do a more detailed risk assessment on certain areas, not on everything. And we talk about a risk-based approach, but risk assessment is part of your risk management framework. It's part of how you manage your risks. And the risks that you're worried about, that you should be concerned about, are those that threaten the achievement of your objectives. If it doesn't threaten the achievement of your objectives, it's not something you should be worried about. And now the third parties that you're working with, they're just an extension of your organization. So they should be covered by your risk management framework. Briefly on a risk-based approach. I don't know any manager that has more resources than they need. You always need more than you have. So what do you do as a professional manager? You focus on what's important. You focus on the things that could cause you the most grief. This is like a risk-based approach. If you can't do everything, you focus on the big things, on the critical activities, and on those providers of those critical activities. They should be getting most of your attention. And I would say more than once today, don't overlook other key suppliers of the non-service items. They are third parties as well, and you will have a number that you depend upon, as we shall see. And so to the when do you conduct a risk assessment? It's like any risk assessment, I guess. The first one is prior to entering the arrangement. Makes sense. And a certain amount of risk assessment so you know what you're getting into, as Warren Buffett said. The next three, I would say, for any risk assessment, when there's a change in the environment, when there's a change in the arrangements, you have a third party and you decide to give them more work. You're now increasing your reliance on them. I think that warrants a reassessment of the risks. I think if there's a change in the environment, and by that I mean it could be the regulatory environment, the regulator brings out new rules. How does that affect your third party? Are they still compliant? Are they still authorized? Can you still outsource that function to them? So there may be a change in circumstances in the environment. If you've outsourced to another country that is undergoing political change, you need to be alert to that, and it may cause you to reassess the risk. And what if the third party themselves get acquired or get into financial difficulty? If their circumstances change, one, you need to be aware of it, and that should trigger another risk assessment. You can't say that we should do risk assessment every year or every 2 years. That doesn't work for me. You have to do risk assessment when the environment, when the conditions is telling you things have changed, and if they've changed, you need to reassess. Okay. As Fiona said, I chair the National Committee on Risk Management Standards, and I'm a member of the ISO TC262, which is the owner of the ISO 31000 Risk Management Standard. And this graphic is from the risk management process, and I've highlighted just the risk assessment element of that. And the first thing you'll notice is that risk assessment is 3 steps. A lot of people refer to the analysis bit as the assessment, but assessment starts with risk identification. Any risk you have not identified, you may be carrying unwittingly. So it is important that you spend some time trying to identify what the risks are before you try to analyze the details of those risks. So let's have a look. And you see on the top right, I've put a little graphic so you know we're talking about risk identification now. And I think the starting point is to identify who your third parties are. And where do you start? Well, a good tip might be to ask your accounts payable people for a list of all the people you pay. And that will be a very long list, but it's at least, it's a complete list. And then you can identify, well, who are the service providers? And then maybe you start with who are the critical service providers. Remember the risk-based approach. You won't have the resources to do everything, but you need to identify the critical ones. And if you're in the insurance space, and I know that we have a good bunch of people in the insurance space listening in today, you will have agents. And agents, again, are third parties. And they could be threatening your reputation, you know, if their behavior is, as they represent you, is unacceptable. Suppliers, and I said I would mention this several times, but suppliers, we may not think of them as third parties, but you think of power and gas and fuel and internet. How many of you could operate without your internet? And do you think your internet service provider as a supplier or even as a service provider, are they in that list, either as a service provider or as a supplier of a utility? Because we think of internet as a utility. How many of you have more than one connection into your building if the internet is so critical? And I'm talking about in the front of the building and maybe in through the air at the top, and maybe a second or the third from the back of the building. Because if you have two providers coming in the same pipe in the front of the building, then the one JCB could take out both of them. So if it is critical, if you are dependent on the internet and you only have one connection to your building, you have a single point of failure. You need to be aware of that and have a plan, or maybe get a second one. And if you're a housing agency, a housing association, you may describe some of your third parties as contractors, you know, electrical contractors, plumbing contractors, could be project management. Again, they are an extension of your organization and they bring risks with them. So you need to understand the risks, and you need to analyze the risks, and you need to ensure that they are being managed. So create your list, and I thought I would do a graphic as to reinforce that. If you start with your company and then say, well, we've outsourced our IT to one service provider, and trying to identify the risks here as well, you might have an information security risk. And then if you outsource an activity like collections to a company, as many companies do, but then you realize they outsource to their third party, your fourth party, and it happens to be outside of Europe, and maybe brings with it some additional risks, whether it's, you want to call it offshoring risk or country risk. And again, if you're in a regulated environment, is the outsourced company regulated? Is their outsourced, their fourth party, are they regulated? And what risks does that bring? If they're in a country that has severe storms or climate or floods, and hardly an article, you can't research this subject and not come across modern slavery. And I've seen questions asked of me about modern slavery in due diligence. But the starting point here is know who your third parties are, and indeed the third parties of your third parties, and build your risk map. So you outsource maybe some of your back office functions, and when you look more closely, you realize actually you've probably outsourced quite a few to one particular provider. And you might consider that as a concentration risk. If that provider now has a problem, it affects you not just in one part of your service, but in multiple. So you might have a concentration risk. And this is a favorite of mine, the payroll, because we just assume it happens. You outsource payroll to a company, and there is risks that go with that. You're giving them sensitive data. It's employee information. And in the wrong hands, that could lead to identity theft, and you don't want to be responsible for that. And prompt you again, think of your suppliers. And I put in fuel here because of, well, we all know what we're paying at the pumps today for fuel. And there is talk of fuel shortages, and there is talk of rolling blackouts in the winters. So you might be dependent on your generator like you never were before. The generator was always there and you always had fuel. But if there's a supply chain problem, and your supplier can't get fuel and you can't get fuel and the electricity goes. I don't want to scare you guys. I'm just trying to give you I suppose, a method for trying to identify, one, your third parties, and two, your risks, because the identification, we're still in the identification phase. Now, extended enterprise, all of this, and you can see I've drawn a frame around this. This is your extended enterprise. In any risk management framework, you've got to consider all of the elements, not just inside your building, but in your third parties. And I've added some common risks here that you could apply to any of your third parties. Financial distress. If they hit the financial problem and if they're going out of business, one, you need to know, and two, I'd say you need to have a plan. I'll pick not all of these, but service level agreements. If the service is dropping off, if you're not getting the service level that you have contracted with the third party, that might be an indication that something is going wrong. So we'll talk more about that later, but certainly when you outsource a service to a third party and you've made a commitment to your customers to deliver a service, there is a heightened risk because you're no longer in direct control of that, but you still are responsible. I want to pick on service disruption because, let's face it, if the ones that are going to hurt you most are those incidents, those interruptions to service that last a long time, or let's say a time that is longer than what is acceptable. If it's 5 minutes, it might be acceptable. If it's 5 hours, less so. If it's 5 days, now you could be seriously damaged. So you should be interested in drilling down on some service disruption risks. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this here, but take the first level. If you're looking at, and again, risk-based approach, you can't do this maybe for every single third party, but the critical ones. And look at how the risk of a system failure is managed. Whatever the cause, whether it's a loss of power or whether it's a cyber attack, that's secondary to you. If your third party suffers a system failure, you want to know how quickly can they recover. Now, you might want to know certainly what defences they have in place to prevent it in the first place, and that's all part of it. Building loss, again, whether it's fire or flood, it doesn't matter. If your third party is out of their building, have they got a contingency plan? People, and we can talk about pandemic now, and 3 years ago, that wouldn't have figured much in people's risk register. But think of loss of people, think of full employment at the moment, which anybody who's trying to employ people know it's difficult to get people, the right people with the skills at the moment. Financial, how healthy are your third parties? And if they hit a financial problem, how will they cope? If they have a fourth party, or their third party, your fourth party, that they're dependent on, and they have a problem, how are they fixed? And then if in the course of their work, they get a regulatory sanction, not because of something they did for you, but maybe for another customer, how does that impact you? So you have to probably, certainly on some of your third parties, drill a little bit deeper and understand and certainly know what the risks are, know what you're getting into or what you've got yourself into. And so on to risk analysis. And this kind of borders both the identification and analysis. I liked this technique a lot for this purpose. Business impact analysis. If you're not familiar with it, the idea is that you start by identifying all your key processes and activities in the organization. Maybe you have an operations handbook where it's all listed out handily. Identify the owner of those processes and sit down with that owner and have a conversation and understand the nature of the process, but importantly, what the dependencies are, whether it's a system dependency or people dependency or another process dependency. And in the words of one of our customers who told me just in part of doing research for this, I spoke with a number of customers, and he said one of the big learnings for them when they did the business impact analysis was they realized that a lot more interdependencies within the organization between different departments responsible for different processes. And he said that was a big learning. People didn't realize that what they were doing was highly important for the next department. So good exercise to do anytime, I would say. But what you're establishing here on this is not just the dependencies, but the next column is MTO, Maximum Tolerable Outage. And you will learn that probably best from the process owner. And the question you're asking is, what's the maximum time that we can not be delivering the service before it begins to hurt us badly? And what you get out of this exercise, if you've got, I mean, I've done exercise with customers where they've had 30 or 40, but whatever the number, you'll get a ranked list of the critical processes. You'll get a prioritized list for the IT department to tell them if something goes, if you have a major disruption, here's the sequence in which things need to be brought back working. You might identify that from a recovery point of view, that you have to adopt a different strategy. You can't just build a new server from scratch. You have to have a backup somewhere because you need this up and running in 2 hours. So it gives you an awful lot of information and gives you great understanding of the risks. Remember, we're in the risk analysis phase. So a well worthwhile exercise to do. Going to pick the payroll company and tell you a real story of a customer who outsourced the payroll company. And they had one guy in the payroll company who would like to ride his mountain bike, except that he fell off the bike and injured himself. And he was out for 3 months. And that's when they realized that they didn't have anybody else who knew the payroll as well as he did. And there was quite a panic to get that payroll out. And you can imagine the distress it will cause in any company if people don't get paid. I picked this one out because we can all relate to it. But don't make any assumptions, you know, on your third parties that it'll be all right. You know, a simple conversation with that supplier could establish very quickly if they have cross-trained people and there's more than one person who can run the payroll. That company actually introduced a change where they now cross-train and they have at least 2 people who can do every payroll and they don't take holidays at the same time. Okay. Staying with the risk analysis. Now, many of you are have been doing this for years, and this won't be new to you, but if you're new to this, what you're looking for in risk analysis is evidence of policies to start with, procedures, training, that people have been trained, that there's a good design of the process in terms of flow and measurements, maybe a good design of forms, gathering information, that there's good communication in the process between the various people who are inputting the information and people who need to know. I think any process, any activity should have a measurement of performance. How do you know it's working? These seem like common things, but if you're doing risk analysis, you need to look for evidence, not just of policy. We talk about policy, operation, and review. And the review, is there evidence there that this process is being continuously monitored such that if things are not working as optimally, that there is some change process happening there to constantly tweak it and make it better and operate more efficiently and effectively? Are there alerts built into the system that if things start to go wrong, there's a red flag raised early on? Indeed, you might have generally a few key risk indicators to start flagging things. So your risk analysis should be telling you if these things are in place. These are controls, and what you want to see is evidence of those controls. Now, often people stop or pay little attention to what happens if there is an incident. And as I said before, your biggest fear is that there's some service disruption, and many of them are short and only last minutes. But your fear should be that a small incident might develop into a longer incident. And the best performing companies ensure that, one, they have fewer incidents, and two, that when they do have an incident, it is as short as possible. And you only have as short as possible incident if you have a plan to address an incident, if you know what to do, if people have been trained in what to do. So if you have a cyber attack, the companies who manage these well have an interruption for 15 minutes or not at all and continue on. And those who have not planned, who have not made the preparations, not put the plans in place, train the people, you're talking about hours, days, weeks, of interruption. So the difference can be quite stark. And know what you're going to say, how you're going to communicate to your customers, to your suppliers, to, if you are a third party, and I know we have some third parties on the call today, how are you going to communicate to your partner? And if you're the partner, if you're the owner of this, how are you going to communicate to your customers? You need to think about these things before you have an event, as uncomfortable as it might be, because you don't have time. You don't have time when everybody's running around like headless chickens. Sticking with the analysis, how do you do it? Well, there are different techniques, and I do a session on risk assessment techniques, but it's hard to beat the physical audit and going and seeing your third party and seeing their operation and meeting the people and pressing the flesh. But you can't do that with every single one. You just don't have enough time. So you'll do that maybe with the critical ones, but you can accomplish a lot with questionnaires, with structured questionnaires that elicit the information you're looking for. Good questions that get the information you need, and group these questions. Don't send everybody your 200 question set, because the 200 questions don't apply to everybody. We get questionnaires from suppliers, and I would say very few have tailored them. The good ones tailored somewhat, but some just send us everything, and you realize that they're asking us questions that don't really apply to us. Don't annoy your third party with that, honestly. You want to get answers, so give them the set that applies to them. I think if you're already in business, in an arrangement with a third party, you have a vital source of information about how the risks are managed on the service levels. If the service levels are being met continuously, happy days. Are you getting reports of incidents? And if you're not, you should, and it should be in the contract that there is full disclosure there, that the third party tells you of any incident, because that's important intelligence for you. If incidents become more frequent and more serious, then you have at least advance warning, and you can insist maybe that certain action is taken before you have a big damaging incident. You need to have this information. And I often say to people, if you do a risk assessment on the 1st of January, and we're now on the 14th of July, and you have done nothing in the meantime, that risk assessment is probably out of date. Actually, probably went out of date on the 2nd of January. So you need to be continuously monitoring. Not necessarily every day or every week, but maybe you have weekly questions or monthly questions or quarterly questions that just tell you that the status as you assessed it on the 1st of January continues or is better today. You need to gather information. That assessment is not a once-off activity. I think it's a continuous process, and you need to be feeding that process. Now, just some examples from our system on different graphics. You can have lists of questions with answers. You can have a dashboard of incidents that will communicate pictures fairly quickly, and all of this you'll get in a system. This is an example of a questionnaire, again, out of our system, where you've structured questionnaires asking questions about a particular aspect. In this case, it's about the legal agreement, and the I here is referring to its requirement from GDPR. So where it's required, you need to drill down and get answers to questions so you understand. We're in the analysis phase. You need to understand what level of controls, what controls are in place and whether they're effective. So you've identified your risks, you've identified your third parties and the risks, and you've drilled down and you've done the analysis. The last part of the risk assessment is making a decision. It's the evaluation. It's looking at your risks, and if you have, and we don't have scope for today, but if you have criteria where you've said, well, anything, and this is crude, but it's a first step, if you like, in the process. You said anything up to 9 we can live with. if we're talking about a 5x5 scale, 25. And if it's between 9 and 13, then it's amber and we need to take some action. And if it's above 15, then that's red and we need to take urgent action now. So if you have that in your system and you assess the risks, then you can quickly produce a risk register that will be a subset of your overarching risk register. This is just risks that you've now tagged with your third party. This is now the beginning of the next step, which is taking some action to address the risks. Now you need this because what's the point in assessing the risks if you're not going to take some action to address the ones that are unacceptable? You need this so you can report to your board and senior management team and give them the assurance that one, you've identified the risks, you've analysed them, and you know where the weaknesses are, and you're doing something about it. Because this will be quickly followed with a report of here are the action items, here's what we're going to do next week, next month. And finally, I think we've just managed on the time, leaving some time for Q&A. My final slide is evidence. You need evidence because if you're the risk management officer, then you need to be gathering the evidence that shows you are managing the third-party risks. The board will want to know that. And if I was the regulator, the first question I would ask you is, show me a list of all your third parties, and in particular, the ones that are critical to your operations. Certainly, if you're a regulated entity, I would want to see that. I'd like to see the risks associated with them and evidence that you have analysed and you understand what controls are in place to manage those risks. And give me some reassurance that you're happy that the risks are well managed. I think some evidence of service level adherence, that you're getting the service that you had contracted for. I think results of monitoring, as I said, if you do an assessment on the 1st of January, and we're now 14th of July, tell me what's happened in the meantime. Tell me that, you know, we've had only 2 incidents that were minor and we've made some changes. We've checked controls and there are people following them, they're following the policy, following the procedure. You need that constant reassurance. I think if a regulator comes visiting, it won't be enough to show them that you have policies and procedures. I think they will fail you if you can't demonstrate, show them evidence that your policies and procedures are working. And if you don't have that evidence, how do you convince a regulator to say, yeah, it's well on paper, but I don't see any evidence that you're even checking that it's working? So you need the evidence for yourself, but worst case, the regulator. But I would say do it for yourself first. You know, I would, if I was asking you questions, if you're the risk officer, I would say, tell me your plans, how you're going to stay on top of this, how you keep your knowledge and understanding of the level of risk up to date. What are your plans? What do you do on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis? And as part of that, I would be looking for regular communication with your third party. It's only through regular communication, and whether that is weekly, monthly, or quarterly, that information gets exchanged. Maybe you find out early that the third party is looking to be acquired. You know, you want no surprises. I would finish with that. You can manage it if you know in advance, but the last thing you want is a surprise on a Monday morning, something you didn't know that possibly you should have known. Okay, that's me done, folks. I hope you got something from that. As Fiona said, the slides will be made available. So I'm happy to take some questions. I can see
there are several questions, Jerry. Some came through in the chat while you were presenting, and there are a few in Q&A. So I'll take them in order as they came in. So Fanny Morani, she asked, what are the risk identifiers for remote working? It's probably not relevant to your presentation in regard to third parties, but certainly some third parties will be working remotely. So it's, you know, there is a risk of linked to remote working.
The risks in remote working, and off the top of my head, I would say internet connectivity. You know, that has this person or people who are working remotely, have they got good connectivity, assuming that they need connectivity to be able to work. How about data protection? If they're working on confidential information, I know that in one organization locally, they don't allow people to print. So even if you have a printer at home, you cannot print any document, and that is intentional. But do they have a clear desk policy? You know, if they have the neighbour come in for a cup of coffee, is the information still confidential? So you have that. You have health and safety risks that even though the person might be working from their dining room table, you as an employer still have a responsibility that their working environment is safe and healthy. And a dining room table is not an ideal. No, it's generally it's too high. It's not the best working environment. So yeah, it's not today's topic, but maybe we will do a webinar on working remotely. Fiona.
Yep. So the next one is from Patricia. Can you explain concentration risk again, please?
Well, that's an interesting question, because if you're coming from the perspective of the regulator, and I don't know how employee or companies can address this, because they'd say that's the regulator's problem to worry about. But we'll start with that. The regulator would be concerned if in the fund management space, let's say, that I'm going to say 60% of the fund management companies all outsource to one particular third party. And now they have a systemic risk. They realize if that third party now fails, that it impacts quite a significant number of companies and therefore consumers in that space. So they don't want to see a lot of eggs in one basket there. So that's concentration risk from the regulatory point of view. From your own company point of view, the more you outsource to one single company, the more, I would say that's a concentration risk. If that company now gets into difficulty, whatever that difficulty might be, whether it's a service disruption, fire, flood, or financial difficulty, it affects not just one aspect of your service that you're delivering, it probably affects 5 or 6, and therefore the impact on you is multifold. You could probably cope with one process that you need to maybe find somebody else to do it or take it in-house, but if you've got 6 or 7, yeah, you've got a bigger problem. Fiona?
Yep. So Mick asks, whose policies and procedures are you referring to? Is it the third parties? Is it ours? And how do we establish how meaningful their policies are?
Another good question. If you've outsourced to a third party, then I think you're interested in their policy. Take information security. If you've outsourced a service whereby you now have either personal information that you've given them, or maybe it's company secrets, secret algorithm or secret formula, or just confidential sales and customer information, then you need to know that they have good controls for protecting that. And the starting point, I think, in any control is your policy. Show me your information security policy, because the company's information security policy is what dictates all of the procedures and practices thereafter. So yes, you're interested in their policy. The internal policy you are interested in is your own outsourcing policy. I did one a few years ago. I'm currently updating it to reflect current thinking, but you should have your own policy in terms of deciding when do you outsource, you know, and how do you outsource, and how do you choose people, and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So you need to have your own outsourcing policy. But to answer your question, it's generally the policies of third parties that you're interested in and the procedures, because they're now the ones who are effectively managing the risk. Fiona?
Yep. Thank you, Jerry. Two related questions, one from Mick and another from Jane. Do you have templates that can be used as a starting point for an assessment?
Depending on the risk, yes. We have in our system, we've written, I'm going to say, about 3,000 risks. Anything from preventing money laundering in an organization, and if you're in the aviation space, towing aircraft, handling hazardous substances. It's quite diverse. We've health and safety risks, we've IT risks, preventing unauthorized access to systems and information. So we have a lot of that, but I would never say that we have all of the risks for all of our clients. You still have to sometimes do the legwork yourself and come up with a template to assess the risk. And certainly if you're getting into something new and different, it's probably unique and you have to write the questions. You can get a template for business impact assessment, which happy to share the template I use. And I've done this with a few clients, but you probably find something on the internet as well. So there's a good template for that. I guess it depends on the purpose of the risk assessment. And if there's interest, folks, we do a session on risk assessment techniques, but there are, I would say, maybe 20 different techniques, and some techniques are better at identifying risks, some better at analysis, and some better at deciding on which treatment option is the best. What will be most effective in reducing the risk. So you have different techniques. But templates, question templates, we have loads of that.
Yep. From Emer, should or can each of these elements be applied the same way on internally outsourced activities, i.e. intra-group, or would you apply a scale back approach?
Another interesting question. Intra-group. Intra-group is picked up by the regulator as a special category. Because let's compare it. If you outsource to a third party with nothing to do with you, and they have competitors, you have some leverage over that third party. If they don't deliver the service as contracted, you won't be renewing the contract and you will be going next door. You may be important for them. You may be 20% of their business, so they will be sitting up their attention. Now, compare that with an intra-group. You're a large company, you're in 20 countries. One of your subsidiaries, and I won't pick the country because I don't want to embarrass anybody, but let's say one of the subsidiaries in one country is now providing a service for the other 19. You're one of the 19, and you're not the biggest. But the company higher up has said, you will outsource this part of the activity to the subsidiary. You have little influence on that because it's being dictated elsewhere. And that I would have concerns with. If it's intra-group with that, and the regulator does as well. So you have to consider how do you get the reassurance that the service you need gets done. And I've been there, and I know this, and it's difficult. And I'm not going to give you a panacea and say, here's the magic bullet, but happy to have a conversation with individuals. I have some ideas, but it is difficult. But the regulator will want to know what measures do you have in place to ensure you get the service. If I'll give you one other scenario, because in the first example I gave, you're 20% of that service provider. What if you're 2% of that service provider's business? You have no leverage, really. They probably, I won't say they don't care if you go or not, but I was in this scenario and I paid a premium. I paid a premium that if we had an issue, we went to the top of the queue. And I was willing to pay for that because I realized we were small, but I needed that service. So there are ways of doing it. But so hopefully I've given you some ideas. Fiona.
Okay, an anonymous question. What is the role of the service providers in confirming their risk management? Should SOC 1 and SOC 2 type be made available to facilitate a risk assessment? So I guess the SOC 1 and SOC 2 compliance checklists, yeah.
I'm not a big fan of SOC 1 and SOC 2 of these. They have their purpose. What I think is important if you're going to use SOC 1 and SOC 2 is the scope. Very often these, for those who may not be familiar with them, but if I can understand why people do them, that if you've got 100 customers and they all want some assurance on the state of your risk management, you get an independent auditor to do an assessment, and you provide that assessment then to the 100 customers instead of doing 100 assessments or having to fill out, answer the same questions 100 times. So now if you're on the other side, do you accept the SOC 1? If it's available and you receive it, it might answer 80% of your questions, right? And I would say great, but you need to look at the 20% that maybe is not covered by the SOC, and not assume that the SOC covers everything. It doesn't. So understand it, yes, if the particular third party has to do this for 100 companies and they say, guys, before you ask me 500 questions, read my SOC 1 or SOC 2, and you probably find most of the answers in there. But you on the other side, then you need to ensure that the questions that haven't been answered, haven't been assessed, that you ask them. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jerry. Saurav asks, is it possible to engage in regular conversation if you have hundreds of third parties?
Probably not. And if I refer back to my slide on a risk-based approach, and because you don't have the resources to do everything. So make sure you're having the conversations with the important ones, with the big ones, is what I would say. Mm-hmm. If I was your boss and you're having lots of conversations with unimportant third parties and not with the big ones, then I would say, you're not utilizing your time well. No, focus on the big ones.
Okay, and we have two related questions, one from Jennifer, one anonymous. What guidance would you have for conducting cyber risk assessment on OSPs? And that's a question recently received from the central bank. And Jennifer, is this slightly different in that what risk should you consider when outsourcing to cloud service providers?
I'll start with what are you outsourcing, right? And what information are they carrying? If the outsourced service provider is carrying, for example, in our case, we have users' names and we've email addresses. Hardly, secret for most people. But if you're outsourcing information that is medical information, that is sensitive information, and you think of the consequence if that was breached, if that was stolen, then your expectation as to what that third party has in place will be much higher. So I know it sounds like an evasion, but it depends. It really does depend on the nature of the information. Now, to answer the question, if it's the most sensitive information, and you know from GDPR, they talk about appropriate information security. And we did a recent webinar, and I'm happy to refer to it, where we talked about, we had a subsection in that, what is appropriate information security? And maybe that's where the answer to this question is, because if it's highly sensitive, then you need lots of protection around that. Encryption of the data is probably goes without saying, that you have restricted access to the data, maybe multi-factor authentication. I mean, you could probably write a list of, let's say, 20 controls in IT, and I would say, if it's highly sensitive information, you've got to tick all those boxes, that sort of thing. Difficult to answer it in this question. I'm not evading it. I just think that it's a different answer for every scenario. You want to have appropriate information security, but you don't want to have information security that's costing you an arm and a leg. Availability is one key thing, right? If you outsource something and you need the service to be up 99% of the time, that'll cost X. But if you require, and if you need it, the supplier to provide the service 99.9% of the time, that extra 9 would probably add, I don't know, 50% to the cost. So you can't just dial up the protection and not expect the price to change. So what I would say is appropriate, as it says in the GDPR, make sure it's appropriate. And there's plenty of systems out there and methods, but the biggest thing, and if I was to pick one thing that you should check for, and that is training, cybersecurity awareness. Do they train their staff, the third party, every 3 months? Not every year, but every quarter. No longer acceptable every year. We do it every quarter. And I would look for that, because 50% of the breaches from cybersecurity would be because of the human. So certainly look for that. Day one. The technology is great, but the human is weak. Dawn, I think we're running out of time, but we still have quite a few people online, so we'll take one more question.
Okay, so Mick has just confirmed that it's third-party outsourced service provider risk assessment template he's looking for. And one last question: should a DPIA be performed on any outsourcing arrangement as data is being processed?
Can I ask you to answer that?
Yeah, I'll take that.
As the qualified person in data protection.
Oh yeah, so I guess the key word here is any outsourcing arrangement. So no is the short answer, but the long answer is it depends on the risk to the data subject. So if there's high risk to the data subject as a result of the data that outsourced service provider is processing, then certainly before you engage with them, it would be or before you start the process, it would be worth doing a data protection impact assessment. You're obliged to do it if there's high risk to the data subject, but as you know, as good practice, obviously if there's no risk to the data subject or very little risk, it might be a step too far to do a full DPIA. But certainly medium risk, as a matter of good practice, it would be good to do. But absolutely, for high risk data or high risk to the data subject, a data protection impact assessment is a requirement.
Okay.
So that's it. Lots of thanks coming in, Jerry, and still a lot of people online. So thank you again for joining us this morning. And we will be sending out the slides and a link to the recording. And thank you, Jerry, for a great presentation this morning. Provoked a lot of questions, and I'm sure. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.